Good evening, and a very warm welcome to the Frontline Club. Tonight we're focusing our discussion on Myanmar and the political and ethical divisions, as well as looking into if there'll be any change with the election. And the chair of our discussion is Paul French. He's right here. Normally we have them in the center, but tonight we're doing it Paul's way. Who is an author and widely published analyst, and also a commentator on Asian politics. Before we begin, could I please ask you to check that your phones are on silent or turned off, please? Thank you very much. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you. Well, the reason I'm sitting over here, in Paul's way apparently, is it's all about these guys tonight. It's not. I'm just the ringmaster and maybe the disciplinarian when we get to the questions and answers. Obviously, this is a very timely event. We have what could be quite pivotal general election coming up on the 8th of November in Myanmar. Campaigning has already begun. But beyond the election, we have a lot of wider issues that, of course, need to be talked about. The reform process, the problems with and conflicts that continue between ethnic minorities and Burmese state, the role of the army, and even with the election, the issues around presidential qualification status, the issues around voter registration lists, who gets to vote, who doesn't, and whether or not we'll enter a period of coalition building, what the likely outcome is going to be. As this is the Frontline Club and it's about journalists, we, of course, have hung it on the news hook of the upcoming elections. But I think we're going to end up talking about a lot more with this panel. What we're going to do is each of the four speakers is going to have 5 minutes to kind of give their pitch and say whatever they like. And then I'm going to throw a couple of questions at them, and then hopefully they're going to actually talk to each other and respond to each other in a comradely fashion. One hopes. And then there's a chance for questions and answers. And we'll have quite a lot of time for that because I think there'll be a lot. And when I say questions and answers, I mean questions and answers, not statements and a slight problem for the panel to respond to. So if there's a statement and it looks like it isn't going to become a question, I'm going to be quite severe and quite hard. Okay, so just to introduce quickly, on the far left, they don't say that very often, do they? On the far left is Richard Cockett of The Economist. I don't know how often you get to say that. Who joined The Economist back in 1999 and was their Southeast Asia correspondent for a number of years, based in Singapore, but travelling regularly into Burma. And did The Economist special report, which many of you may remember, in 2013, which was a very good roundup of events. He has, unfortunately the lights went down, so you might not be able to see it. He has, no, it's okay, he just wants a spotlight on that poster if possible. He has, just this week, yes, let's shed light on this issue. He has this week, as you can see here, Blood, Dreams and Gold, a new book on Burma, which I expect he will talk about and is, of course, on sale here. Next to him is Hkanhpa Sadan, who is the General Secretary of the Kachin National Council, based here in the UK, but is an activist for Kachin issues and rights globally in Europe, Asia and the United States. Next to Hkanhpa is Wei Nin, who is a campaigns officer and various other things with the Burma campaign in the UK, and also is partly with us in this country due to her father's activism in the 88 generation student group. She may talk about that, she may not, I don't know, but obviously a long track record of dealing with human rights issues and so on in Myanmar. And finally, last but not least, Robert Cooper, former diplomat, spent a long time with the European Union, and was the that was the United Nations.
No,
it was the
UN.
UN.
The EU, not the UN.
The EU, the UN. UN is just the EU with a few more countries. And a special advisor on Burma, and has been travelling to Burma and looking at issues in Burma, Myanmar for 40 years or so. So that's a lot of experience from a lot of different angles. Perhaps I think we'll just start on the left and work across. That makes most sense. Perhaps, Richard, you could give us 5 minutes.
Yep.
5 minutes on well, your pitch, basically.
Okay,
What you
5
think
minutes, yes.
is important.
Thank you. Good, welcome. I'll just, since I've got a book to plug, I'll get that out of the way very quickly, which is, anyway, it's completely irrelevant to what I'm going to say. So the book was based on my sort of 5 years in Asia, and I got to Burma in the sort of summer of 2010, started going there, and at that point it was still very much under military rule. There was an election in November of that year. Aung San Suu Kyi was released from house arrest just after that. So there were sort of glimmers of change, but we all cynical old hacks dismiss this as sort of window dressing and not very interesting. And then the following year, 2011, clearly there was actually some change. We had a new president, Thein Sein, and he started to be starting some sort of reform process. Then he met for his famous meeting with Aung San Suu Kyi in August of that year, and they seemed to sort of form a team to force reforms through. And from then on, things happened very quickly. So the book is really, the second part is a reflection of, how those reforms came about, how they happened, and also an analysis of how far they may go, and what the challenges and obstacles that remain are. But the first sort of 2/3 of the book really is a history of modern Burma. And so it's the background to these reforms, going right back to the colonial era, really, and indeed the era of Burman hegemony, even before then, and how then the British came into the country, conquered the country, and how there was mass immigration into the country under colonial rule. And the argument of the book really is that Burma's really still living with the consequences of that colonial era, above all. Burma was a sort of confection, really, a colonial confection put together for the convenience of the British administrators. And when it was given independence, it won independence in 1948, of course, led by General Aung San, the father of Aung San Suu Kyi. It sort of pretty well fell to pieces the minute the flag had been run up in January 1948. Civil war started almost immediately, the Karen Civil War, which became the Karen, one of the ethnic groups in eastern Burma, revolted. That became, by 2011, when it ended, the longest-running civil war in history. But most of the ethnic minority groups revolted pretty soon afterwards. The Kachin, we might hear more later, the Rakhine, etc. So basically, the argument of the book is that the country we think of as Burma, we think maybe there will be a reform process, there will be an election, we will restore order in this country. This country has never experienced order. It's never experienced peace. Indeed, it's never experienced an existence as a coherent country at all. The whole has been fighting with each other, struggling with itself ever since 1948. So the task ahead of us is much more difficult, and it's much more profound than probably any country in the modern era has faced. Maybe North Korea finally does something that may be on the same scale as that. And so the context of the election, I want to put the election in that context, that this is but for me it's a sort of marker on the way towards a longer and what should be a much more profound process, hopefully. And frankly, I'm rather gloomy about the prospects at the moment. I think there was a rush of reform 2011, 2012, 2013. And at that moment, the military then, the hardliners, I think, began to dig their heels in. We can discuss this later about to what extent that was true, and have really kind of pushed back against reformers ever since. So there's a tension within Burmese politics going on at the moment about what the future will be, how far the generals really want the reform process to go. So I think, some expectations have been raised too high in Burma, and I think there's a sort of very bumpy road ahead. And just to end on one last thing, going back to the history of it, I begin the book, the first part of the book is called The Plural Society and Its Enemies. And the organizing concept of that first part of the book is the plural society. In the plural society, we're all very familiar with pluralism, etc., as a concept is bandied around in political debate, and we think we all know what it means. But in fact, the plural society was a term invented by a British academic and colonial administrator called J.S. Furnivall in the 1930s, 1940s, and he invented the term specifically to describe colonial Rangoon, what was then Rangoon, what is now Yangon. But in his terminology, in his use of the word, he was using it to describe an alien society imposed upon an indigenous population, and he saw only conflict arising from that. And it's the paradox of Burma. It became one of the most prosperous, wealthy nations in Southeast Asia during the colonial period, largely to that importation, the mass immigration of people from all around the world to the free port of Rangoon, and they made it into one of the most successful entrepôts of the British maritime, the British Empire. And many of those people came from India, the subcontinent, from South Asia, so parts of what is now India, of course, Bengalis, Bangladesh, Pakistan, etc. But there was also an influx, a considerable influx of Jews, of Armenians, of course, all people from the British Empire, from Canada, from South Africa, from Turkey, and eventually also from Germany, from Japan, etc. So it was, to an extraordinary degree, a very big cosmopolitan society, and I would argue the precursor of the modern globalized societies. The fault line, though, was that this was imposed upon the Burmans, and the Burmans never got to share very much in this plural society, and they saw themselves very much as second-class or even third-class citizens to both the British and the Indians and all the other immigrants. And the process of Burmanization that has happened since the 1960s, military rule, was really to restore the hegemony of the Burmans over the plural society. And it's that tension within Burma that has never been resolved, and that's still playing out. And you can see it today in the anti-Muslim violence, for instance, which has rocked Rakhine State, for instance, in the West, and spread to all over Burma. See, that's a legacy of colonial rule, the pent-up hatred and antagonisms of people, mainly from Bengal, Chittagonians as they were then called, upon the indigenous societies. Just as, for instance, just as at the same time across the fringes of Burma, the ethnic minority groups, the Kachin, the Shan, the Chin, etc., have fought their own wars with Burman hegemony, with the politics of Burmanization in the center. So these tensions, these conflicts, they're a consequence, they all flowed from colonial rule. It's all our fault, in our words, and they've never been resolved. To a certain extent, they were sort of, I would say, pickled in aspic, held, put in the deep freeze during the era of military rule from 1962 right up to the present day, to 2011-12. But once things began to shift, once the country began to reform, these old tensions have risen up, and the consequences we've seen very graphically in Sittwe and Rakhine State and across the country, for instance, in anti-Muslim violence, anti-Muslim sentiment, and in Rakhine State, sadly, I would call ethnic cleansing. Some people have called it a genocide. So this is all happening now. It's all consequences for past. I hope I demonstrate this in the book. And this means that any reform, any progress has to be placed in that context, and it has to be measured, I think, against that past. So that's all I'll say for now.
Thank you. Hkanhpa.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. So, well, I've been involved in Kachin politics since I was born, really. So I was born in the middle of the Civil War, and then every Kachin family, at least one of his family, one of the sons, had to join the Kachin Independent Army. So I'm youngest of the siblings, so I got to go to school, but my brother, my eldest brother, had to join the Kachin Independent Army. So he stayed in the army. I grew up in the Civil War until when I went to university in 1994. And then the Kachin people started to feel what the taste of the ceasefire. But I've been through that 88, and it was when I was the only high school. I joined the demonstration as a high school student. But ceasefire was not real ceasefire for Kachin people, and it was the sham ceasefire. So during the 30 years of civil war, from 61 to 1994, compared to during the ceasefire 1994 to 2011, and more young Kachin people died during the ceasefire period because of the social problem, because of the drugs, and so on. And then also the preventable disease and so on. So I become quite a big advocate for highlighting the real situation of ceasefire when I become living in abroad and so on. So now Burma is so-called changing, and I quite like the title in our discussion, the military ruler to military-backed civilian government. So it's summed up very clearly, the same old wine with a different bottle. So after 2011, and then the ceasefire, after 17 years, the ceasefire broken down again. So Kachin faced another phase of civil war. This time, it's more severe than the last 30 years of the fighting, because Burmese army used, in 2012, they used over 30,000 soldiers to attack the KIA headquarters. Imagine 30,000 of soldiers. This is like invading other country. But we're quite resilient people. We managed to survive. And at the moment, in the Kachin IDP, over 100,000 Kachin IDP around the China-Burma border, and also in the government control area, Myitkyina, Burma, and so on. So reforms in Burma, everybody excited about it. Elections coming in November. A lot in the central Burma, lower Burma, are preparing for the election. And they're thinking about who to vote. And they're learning about how to vote. But for Kachin, I got a news today about 300 villagers from the southern Mansi village. They have to flee their home because the government attacking KIA position and burning villages. And then last 10 days, or 2 weeks ago, about 30 villages, over 1,200 villagers, been trapped in the northern, like Butao regions of Burma, of Kachin state. And the local civil society wanted to send the humanitarian aid, but the government stopped them. And this is crime against humanity we're talking about, blocking the humanitarian aid. And so I know here a lot of you guys are journalists. When I lived in Oxford, I was quite furious when the BBC News showing the New Year celebration in Yangon, 2012. That time, Burmese army sending the fighter jet to attack Kachin position. So the media portray Burma is changing, positive thing, but the ethnic people are being marginalized continuously. So, like I said before, central, very central, Yangon, Mandalay, they're learning to vote. They're happy, they might be able to vote on Aung San Suu Kyi, but for the Kachins, we didn't have a Kachin party didn't allow to participate in election in 2010. And by election, in the 2012 by-election, Aung San Suu Kyi was elected as an MP, but there's 3 constituents vacant in Kachin State. It didn't happen, but there's no by-election because they said because of the war. So 2015 election, like I said, we as exiled Kachins try to raise funds to send money for the IDP. We're busy. We can't focus on the. I'm afraid we can't focus on election. We can't be excited about it. I make no apology about, I can't be excited about such a great 2015 election. The Western people, I make a scenario like when we need help, we don't have a place to live. We need a house to live. What Western community does is they send us, they give us the furniture, sofa, and televisions when we haven't got a roof to live. Because they give us the furniture because they want to dig our garden. That is our perspective of seeing the Western community. The ethnic people are being marginalized, not just military government, also from the Western community as well. So thank you.
Wei Lin.
Thank you. I would like to talk a little bit about the reform process in Burma from a perspective of a human rights activist from Burma. As Hkanhpa said, a lot of observers and diplomats are very excited, and they think that this coming election in November would be a test. But the election is not a test for Burma's so-called transition to democracy. It's just kind of like a test to see whether the political structure created by the military in the 2008 constitution would work or not. The real first up of the reform process in Burma was the introduction of this 2008 constitution, which some of us might remember President Thein Sein was in charge of drafting. And a lot of people are overexcited about the reform process and say, oh, at least these things are going on, and why are you not excited about it? When they drafted the constitution, the Burmese generals faced a real challenge because they wanted to keep their power and their privilege. At the same time, they wanted to keep the power of the military and the influence of the military for the country. And of course, on the other hand, they want to tame the domestic oppositions. They wanted to get the sanctions lifted. They wanted to get international acceptance. So they knew that they had to make some changes to achieve their goals. And there have been a lot of debates and arguments over the, things between hardliners and softliners within the military. But the real thing is not a debate between people who genuinely want a freedom in Burma and people who didn't. It had been between a group of people who were okay to carry on as they were in power, holding on to power, and a group of people knew that they couldn't carry on like they were and they needed to do some changes. So they started introducing some freedom of expression, some speech, and we could see that in 2011, and then in 2012 we saw the release of high-profile political prisoners, visa bans were lifted, and peace initiative launched. So there were some changes. They were making all those changes because 2008 constitution is there. The aim of the constitution is to create an appearance of change, while still holding on to military power and while giving the military the power to decide on economy and politics of the country. They had to make changes because comparing to neighboring country, Burma was, far behind the neighboring countries. And we are a very proud people. And Burma was becoming marginalized politically and economically, and sanctions were there, and we couldn't do any business apart from doing business and development projects with Chinese companies. So, and the military which they depend on was well below the size of it should have been. Soldiers were badly trained, badly equipped, and badly demoralized. So that was the motivation. And international media and newspaper, they were so overexcited about the process of reforms, and they were completely taken in by reforms, and they completely ignore the human rights abuses in Burma. People were still getting arrested, women and children are being raped in ethnic area, but none of the newspaper reported it. They ignored it. Most of the newspapers and media were filled with positive news story about Burma and how changes are going on. And of course, the entire, some diplomats were very excited. But I would say that, sometimes they got overexcited and giddy about it rather than seeing the reality on the ground of what's going on. And if you go and see the Kachin state, you can see people are still being raped and being killed. And people still have to leave the country. And also, if you go to Western Burma, you can see the Rohingya issue. But of course, international community response is let's wait and see. And after some of those changes going on in 2012, it's the international community response was probably more than the general had ever hoped for, because sanctions swiftly began to be suspended and then lifted. Aid increased, and technical assistance were offered, and of course head of states and first foreign ministries and ministers and then head of states outdo each other of how soon they visited Burma and how exciting it was to see everything. And also it was followed by a trade delegation, and the diplomatic focus switched from human rights issues to what kind of business deal they could win. And of course, it's all under the disguise of helping Burma to develop. It's, that was the thing going on. And probably, maybe, the Burmese generals kind of recognized and understood something that most Burmese activists, democracy activists didn't. They kind of knew that for international community, a normal dictatorship would be good enough. And they didn't need to go all the way towards democracy. They just needed to make some change to get sanctions lifted. And they knew that half of the world is ruled by dictatorship and authoritarian regime. And, those people have relatively good and normal relationship with the rest of the world. So the regime knew that, and that was their plan to move out of a pariah status, but not going into democracy status. So you can see, a lot of democracy activists and human rights activists are getting involved in this election, but none of us have the illusion that we would be closer to genuine democracy and freedom after the election in November. It's still a very long way to go, and there's nothing to be overexcited about. And Burma is still a very long way to go to achieve a genuine democracy, peace with ethnic people, and freedom of speech and freedom of expression in the country. So that's what I would like to say this evening. Thank you.
Well, it sounds from, I didn't get your name right.
Wei Ning.
Sounds from what Wei Ning said as though things have got really badly worse in the last 5 years. I don't think that's probably true in Kachin, but I don't think that that's necessarily the experience of everybody in Burma, that everything has got worse. After all, a large number, I mean, there are still some people in prison who shouldn't be there, but large number of political prisoners have been released. We'll see about the elections. First of all, I agree, the 2008 constitution is not designed to bring democracy to Burma. It's designed to preserve military government by legal means rather than by killing people. But let's see, because what's happening now hasn't happened for quite a long time. That's to say that there's going to be an election and maybe there will be some areas where the election won't take place, and Kachin may well be one. On the other hand, I think the government actually has been making an effort to end the civil wars. Maybe it's not been sincere in Kachin. There's a particular problem in Kachin because it's very rich, and there's lots of money being made out of timber and jade. More out of jade because they've taken all the timber by now. But I think it's wrong to give the impression that everything that has happened in the last 5 years has been bad. I think things have got better on the whole for quite a lot of people in Burma. At least that's what they seem to say. As for people making money there, well, maybe they will someday, but I don't think anybody's making much money there at the moment. But what is happening is there's an election taking place on November the 8th, which maybe will be open and fair. It's being contested by a large number of parties. It's got a large number of observers, a very large number of local monitors, and a large number of international observers there. And that's not happened before. It's being contested by the NLD. The NLD's made a decision that they're going to run in the election. Now you can say that that is a scandal and a mistake, and they shouldn't accept the 2008 constitution, but how else are you going to see change in the country? And the real question is what happens after the election. Supposing the NLD wins a large majority, plus the ethnic parties. Supposing the USDP is more or less wiped out, then the question arises, what's going to happen? Supposing you wanted peaceful change in this country, expecting the military to commit collective suicide isn't likely. On the other hand, the military is attempting to use legal means of retaining power. Well, maybe you can manipulate that against them. They want to run a fake democracy. Well, maybe you can actually, you can make them go further than they want to. You take advantage of the fact that they're holding elections and you get authentic representatives of the people elected. Already it's gone wrong for them because they discovered, this is a bit complicated, but the president of the parliament, U Shwe Man, he was the kind of, he was a more senior general than Thein Sein, but I don't know for what reason. Maybe because Thein Sein is a little bit less charismatic, a bit softer. Thein Sein got to be president, and Shwe Man became president of the parliament. Actually, the parliament has, since that time, been in a constant dispute with the government. So there is some element of pluralism in this. A few weeks ago, the government party got fed up with Shwe Man, who also happened to be the president of the government party, and they deposed him as leader of the party. How did they do this? Well, they did it by surrounding his house with troops and holding a meeting in the party headquarters to deselect him, with the party headquarters also surrounded by troops. So the military haven't disappeared at all. On the other hand, when they tried to get a vote in the parliament to get rid of Shwe Man as president of the parliament, they failed. And the machinery that they've created in the constitution is no longer completely under their control. Now there's an election taking place. We'll see what's going to happen in the election. It's not going to be a kind of, it's not going to be the sort of election that you would see in Sweden or Switzerland. it's already clear that there are vast amounts of money being spread around. It's quite likely that the election won't be able to take place in some bits of the country if fighting continues. But maybe, I mean, you know, there's still a last-minute effort to reach ceasefire, including in Kachin. Maybe it could be done. But I think there's some chance that the election is going to be a better election than most of the ones that have been held before. That means that the military is going to be faced with a lot of people who they never planned to get elected. And that's when if that happens, I think they'd be reluctant at the moment. I don't know. Others will know better. I think the military will be cautious about going back to killing people in the street. I don't think they want to do that. They want to see if they can make this experiment work. But it's not going to work. And that's the bet that the National League for Democracy has taken, that they can actually mobilize the people against the military. And that's really what the election is, essentially the people against the military. The people in this case includes a large range of parties in the ethnic areas as well. Nobody knows what, opinion polling is non-existent. Nobody knows who's going to win. Most people are betting that it's not the government party and that you're going to have a large number of winners from the ethnic communities if the elections are held there, and probably a large number of people from the NLD. And then we see what happens. That's the bet that the NLD is taking at the moment.
Thank you. I'd like to try and get you guys to do two things. Both of them are quite horrible, but you know, you're the four people that are selected for the task, unfortunately. One is we have elections on the 8th of November, and I would like you to say what you think is going to happen. And also weighing in, I mean, you know, we can start with you, but also this issue of, okay, there are elections, that's better than no elections perhaps. What else has to happen in Burma, as well as the election, to move forward? And I'd be quite interested in what you think is going to happen and what needs to happen.
Yes, I'd like to correct one thing first. It's what I said in my status. It didn't, you know, I didn't say anything about things gone really badly in last 5 years. What I was saying, the motivation behind the government, you know, introducing changes in reform process and international community getting overexcited rather than focusing on the reform process and also focusing on people being killed in ethnic area. So that's what, you know, I didn't say anything about, oh, things gone horribly wrong in last 5 years. And of course, election is a very exciting thing. We haven't had this chance for, you know, so long, and a lot of people in Rangoon, Mandalay and in central area are very excited about getting involved voting, but there are chunk of people who can't be excited about it because they don't even have a home to live and they don't even have an identity card to go and vote for it. So we need to remember those people as well. There needs to be a you know, balance rather than and also, of course, it's easy for international community and Western people to say, let's wait and see. Let's see what's going to happen after the election. And that's what happened in 2010 was, oh, you know, it's just started. The system just started, so let's see what's going to happen in 2015. We might have Aung San Suu Kyi as a president. We are in 2015. Next month, we have an election. Aung San Suu Kyi won't be a president, but maybe who knows? Let's wait and see. And, you know, while people are dying in ethnic area, in the Kachin state, in Karen state. So perhaps for a you know, person from Burma, I find it very hard that Western people take a step back and say, well, maybe let's wait and see after the election what's going to happen. And then after the election, oh, it's you know, we won't have government till February, so let's wait and see who's going to be in the government and who's going to become a president. So it's like, are you going to wait and see while your family members are dying in Burma? My dad is a former political prisoner, and all the repressive laws in Burma still remain in place. And he was out on parole in 2012, and he could be arrested anytime if a government decides to do so, because 2008 Constitution permit them to do whatever they want to do. So the Constitution is the real problem. If they built it there, they designed it there to normalize the international relation, they designed it there to keep the military in power. So, of course, election is a very exciting thing, but at the same time, we need to remember the problems in the country.
Richard, this is what we used to talk about. Everyone used to talk about roadmaps. We had a roadmap everywhere, didn't we?
Yes, they had I think they had the generals had a 7-step roadmap.
You seem to be suggesting that this election is a stage, a way station on a roadmap.
Well, another interesting way to look at it, this was pointed out to me by someone, is that in the general's mind, I mean, just put yourself in the general's mind for a bit. So this all goes back to 1988 and the student uprising and Aung San Suu Kyi, which your father was involved in. So, and the generals after that, they had to find a way to move forward to keep the country together, faced with a sort of revolt, not only amongst the Burman majority, but the continuing wars with the ethnic conflicts of the minority areas. So they implemented what they regarded as a reform process really right back in the early 1990s. And from the 2000s, particularly Tan Shui, the former dictator, started this process, and he wanted a constitutional convention. There was a referendum on the constitution in 2008, led to the implementation of the new constitution. Within that constitution was the provision for elections in 2010, they were held, and for the appointment of a new president, which happened in 2011 with Thein Sein. So in many ways, in their own mind, some of them, I think, probably believe that the reform process is over. It ended in 2011. That was it. That was the point of it all, what the previous 15 years had led up to. So since then, this has been a sort of bewildering footnote to what they regard as how Burma should have changed, which makes this election, in their own minds, a sort of something that almost shouldn't be taking place. It wasn't actually in the roadmap originally. And I'll just say one other thing about how we judge the reforms that have taken place so far, particularly over the past 4 or 5 years. Yes, there are lots of arguments about how far has the country moved forward, how genuine have the changes been. I mean, one of the ways I've judged Burma, which is to look at it in the context of the region. That basically you should judge Burma against the standards of the region, not against standards of Western democracy or British parliamentary democracy, etc. It's for neighbours. It's an ASEAN country. Judge it by the region. And I used to travel a lot from Thailand to Burma, Burma to Malaysia, Burma to Vietnam, Singapore to Burma, etc. So I could compare very close up what's happening. And, I agree with Robert there, the reforms in Burma, the release of the political prisoners, the end of most censorship, the end of bans on assemblies and meetings, etc. All this has actually been going forward at a time when most countries in the region have been regressing. I mean, for God's sake, the neighbour of Burma is Thailand. And, in 2013, the military have had a coup there. They've just said that they're not interested in any elections. They're going to hang on there until who knows when. And when that all happened, the joke was that lots of, because it's so oppressive in Thailand at the moment, a lot of journalists and intellectuals had to flee Thailand over the border to go to Burma, where I met them in Yangon, and they said, phew, thank God we're out of Thailand. We managed to made it to the haven of peace and democracy, that is Yangon. That's how they experienced it. These were people who'd normally gone the other way. Look at Malaysia, which is now regressing at a terrible rate. Malaysia and Singapore, as you probably know, they've had lots of elections and never changed government. Look at Vietnam. That's got vastly more repressive in terms of journalists and suppression of information over the past 2 and 3 years. And, Cambodia sets other standards. Hun Sen has been in power, the brutal dictator, for 25 years now, 26 years. And yet Burma, in 4 years, I would say, has accomplished more in terms of reform than all those countries put together. In fact, many of them, as I say, have regressed. So in that context, I think actually, Burma's achievement is quite a lot. Yes, it's come to a halt. Yes, the military have got to a point where they're not quite sure how much they want to go on. But let's not dismiss what's happened in the country since 2011 to about 2013, 2014.
Hkanhpa says, same old wine, different bottles. If you're frozen out of the elections, if other people are making decisions that could affect you, which further marginalize you because they're moving down some sort of democratic road that you're not even involved in, right? Where does this election leave you?
Well, I think it's going back to why the reason behind the reform started. I look at it like because I'm a food technologist. It's like a pressure cooker, you know. You need to release the steam, otherwise it's gonna explode. That's why they open up like a pressure cooker, release the steam. Because they worry about explosion. It had exploded in 2007 leading by monk called Saffron Revolution. They had tasted that a little bit of explosion. So the general realized that they need to release the steam for the pressure cooker, otherwise it's gonna explode. That's the main kind of like pressure. That's what I see it. You know, Robert's mentioned about parliaments. We have a parliament. That parliament passed the most discriminated religions law in the world. I don't want my daughter to live in Burma at the moment because she can't choose who she wants to marry. You know? So, like, in the parliament, that's 25% military men with a uniform. They're staring at Aung San Suu Kyi when she walked. Right? So, like, you know, this election, I was thinking on the way in, this election is a bit like, you know, Usain Bolt in a 25-meter advance, and you're racing against him. How could you win? You know, Aung San Suu Kyi win, but military 25% there. They can veto anything. And then, so one positive thing I want to make the whole night. That would be one positive.
Everyone's only allowed one,
yeah,
by the way.
one positive thing. Because I'm quite pleased that, because Deng Xiang is world-class liar. Yeah. So he's treated in the media as a quiet man. You know, he's listening to the public, people. So the Kachin leader said, as long as Deng Xiang is in power, we don't want to sign a ceasefire because he's very good at lying. But one positive thing, that Min Aung Hlaing, who is the chief of army defense, he's not very good at lying. That's why we still, you know, got something to say about it.
See, Robert, I can see a problem, a two-track problem, where we have an election. It feels positive to some people in Rangoon and elsewhere. There may be more economic investment. There may be the growth of a middle class. All of these things that we've seen in some other places. Life may get better for some people, and then issues like the Kachin or Rohingya, these just get pushed to one side, and we have a two-track where one part of Burma goes off, maybe on a positive reform road that certainly Western companies may like and investors may like and the European Union may like, but a whole slice, about 40%, if you would take all ethnic minority people, right, would just be left behind on this. How do we stop that two-track?
No, this country is full of problems, and they're all different. I mean, at the moment, the Rohingya are very badly treated in all kinds of ways, and in particular, they're disenfranchised. Pretty much none of them are going to vote, and this is happening in one or two of the other ethnic areas as well, but not on the whole. Kachin is a separate problem because Kachin is one of the places. Kachin is the place where there is still a major civil war going on. Now there are some other less important wars going on in Kokkan and so on, but the big war that's going on still is Kachin.
Shan State as well.
Well, but by and large, but in many of the other places, there have been ceasefires which are functioning, and the elections will probably take place in the Karen states, for example. This is a very big war which has come to an end. So it's not that 40% of the country is going to be disenfranchised by civil war. Civil wars are in a limited place. I would hope personally that a ceasefire can be achieved in Kachin as well, because because if you really want, if you want to have democracy in a country, you need to end the civil wars. You can't have elections when there's fighting going on. I'm not involved in peace negotiations, and it's always complicated. And there are good reasons for the Kachin not trusting the government at all. But nevertheless, if you carry on fighting, then you'll carry on fighting. And then you can, well, if you're going to win, that's fine.
Sorry, can I just, we are defending, not fighting.
Right.
That's the difference. They are attacking us. So that's the difference between fighting and defending.
Well,
so
I'm not planning to conduct a ceasefire negotiation here. So,
but one thing is the European Union is actually sponsoring the Myanmar Peace Center. It's the main sponsor. So I know Robert is not personally contacting the ceasefire, but the European Union is sponsoring that ceasefire process. So
we're actually in favor of peace.
Absolutely,
now,
everybody
maybe
wants
this
peace.
is bad, but
Yeah.
that's what we're in favor of. And we're willing to put some money into it. We actually have quite large sums of money available to deal with the problems when the ceasefires actually take place. But if the fighting continues, then the fighting will continue. And I don't think it's going to do that much good for anybody. And you're right, Kachin has been extremely badly treated by the government. But leaving that aside, so what do? Do you decide that everybody should boycott the elections? Is that a good choice? The Constitution is terrible. The elections held in 2010 were fraudulent. What took place in 2010 was not a change of regime, it was a change of clothing. The soldiers took off their uniforms and put on civilian clothes. However, since then, some good things have happened. I think release of political prisoners is a good thing. I think the end of censorship is a good thing. Now, none of this is perfect. There is lots of repressive legislation still on the statute books. A large number of it comes from British legislation, actually. Censorship has been abolished. Actually, pretty much a free press in Yangon, but some uncertainty because journalists still get occasionally arrested because they've irritated somebody. But I think by most standards in the world, there's something like a free press there. Will the elections be fair? I don't know. I do know that they've invited at least 3 groups of international monitors, and there's going to be a large number of domestic monitors as well. What's going to happen when the results come out and it turns out that the army hasn't won? I don't know, but it seems to me that that's at least an opportunity for change.
Okay.
So there.
Look, I'm going to throw it open to you lot. Sophie has got a microphone, and because we are, this horrible term, live on YouTube, could you wait for the microphone so that the thousands and millions of people listening can hear? This gentleman down here was first with his hand up in the blue shirt. And remember what I said, questions, not statements. I'll get nasty.
Could the panel say more about the 4 rules against religious practice and the, and excuse my pronunciation, the affiliations and the use of different religious groups politically, particularly the Buddhist Bata?
Who'd like to talk about that?
I can, if you like.
Start it off.
Very quickly. These are the four laws. They're called the race and religion laws by the government. And basically it's legislation which was proposed by the Sangha, the monks, the Burmese monks, the organisation of the monks, to the government, which the government has adopted, which seeks to regulate personal relations between people in the country, and particularly it's aimed against the Muslim population. So, for instance, there's a marriage law which will now require if a Buddhist woman wants to marry a Muslim man, they have to get permissions of various members, elders of the community, etc., basically making it extremely hard to do so. One of the laws is also about trying to prevent Muslim women from having too many children, etc. So it's basically aimed at, in their own minds, of preserving the hegemony of the culture and family of the Buddhists against the Muslim minority. Now, this is clearly an electoral tactic. It's been adopted because what the government has been trying to do is to rally Buddhist nationalism to its side as a counter to Aung San Suu Kyi, thus really painting Aung San Suu Kyi into a corner. Because if Aung San Suu Kyi, again historically because of colonial rule and the mass immigration of Muslims, particularly that was so resented during the colonial era, what the government is doing is they're exploiting these resentments, these old hatreds and angers, to rally opinion on their side. What they're saying is by passing these laws, they are the sole defenders of Burman Buddhism against aliens like Muslims. And opinions vary as to what effect this is having. I think in some of the cities it is having an effect, and even a lot of colleagues in the NLD say that this isn't having effect in the ranks of the NLD. NLD local committees of the NLD have been trying to expel. In fact, they've been succeeding in expelling Muslim members of the NLD as part of this kind of atmosphere of what I've called fervent anti-Muslim bigotry sentiment, which is now sweeping through most of the country. So that's why they're doing it. And of course, it puts Aung San Suu Kyi in a terrible dilemma, because if she speaks up on behalf of, say, the Rohingya Muslims, then the government can paint her as an enemy of Burmese Buddhism. Of course, it's ridiculous, but that's how the majority of Burmans, I'm afraid, think, young and old. And that's partly, I would argue, a consequence of the information vacuum of the past 50 years. They've been drip-fed a sort of really poisonous diet, which is now being reinforced on Facebook, Twitter, etc., of anti-Muslim and anti-Rohingya propaganda, which makes for a very poisonous sectarian atmosphere in Burma. And for me, that's one of the real dangers of this election. Could be a real flashpoint that they will exploit all this, in the run-up to the election and even after the election. It'll be extremely explosive in Rakhine State itself, where the Rohingya have been entirely disenfranchised, and the Rakhine nationalists there, Buddhist Rakhine nationalists, will use this to rally opinion. And if they attack Muslims, I'm afraid that's good politically. More people will vote for them.
It's worth adding one footnote to that, and that is to say, these laws were passed in Parliament, having been proposed by the government, by the President, by U Thein Sein. These laws were passed in Parliament by a very large majority indeed. The NLD voted unanimously against them, actually taking a political risk.
Yeah, it's for government, it's government directed. And of course, Aung San Suu Kyi has come in for a lot of international criticism, I'm sure you're aware, quite deservedly in my opinion, for not speaking up for the Rohingyas. Even at the height of persecution, when many thousands of them were being driven into the sea to escape ethnic cleansing earlier this year, she still refused to either mention them by name or stick up for them in particular, and that's caused a lot of anguish and resentment in the country and beyond.
Well, maybe I'll say something else.
Can I just add one thing, that the religions law and so on is the motive behind and the root cause. It's been for long times. The idea of Burmanization and chauvinism is one of the root cause of Burma problem, today problem. So the motto of the Burma successive general is one nation, one religion, one blood. they have been using that motto for throughout until now. So we, like any people, we're Christian. We're forced to be a Buddhist. We're forced to learn Burmese. We're not allowed to learn our language at school. So the whole idea about the idea is, if Burma become one nation, one religion, one command, everything will be happy. That is the motive. That's what I like to add. Yeah.
Wayne, this is quite difficult. I don't want to preempt what you're going to say, but this seems to me quite difficult because this anti-Muslim group of people with this agenda are organised. They're going to vote, aren't they? And that again can skew things.
Yes, the Mabada is a Buddhist extremist organization in the country. It's like not only they are going to vote, they're also going around in the country telling people not to vote NLD, because they are telling people that if you vote NLD, then Islamists will take over the country and Burma will become an Islam country. So, and also what we have to remember is it's a small group of people targeting people in the rural area who doesn't have much understanding about why they're very poor and why they don't have enough food to eat. The reality is that they're very poor and they don't have any food to eat because of government is making money out of all the resources we have. So, of course, President Thein Sein could stop Mabada and extremist Buddhists, but he's not doing anything to stop them. And he, passed this legislation, which is discrimination against Muslim, and also, of course, discrimination against women in the country. We have to, tell people who we want to marry. We can't just choose what we want. They don't put that law for men either. It's only for women. So it's a discrimination against women and discrimination against Muslim. And Muslims are, excluded in this election, Rohingya, and also, there are, as far as I'm aware of, there are no Muslim MP to take part in this election. So it's a really well-targeted and also, prejudice against Muslims being ongoing for a very long time. And Mabada is very clever to target people and tell lies about, if you get married to Muslim, then you will have to convert, otherwise they will torture you, or Muslims breed like dogs. They have, 6 or 7 children. So all the, like bad things. And I'm a Muslim myself. Sometimes I feel, not angry, I feel very sad that when I was in country 8 years ago, my township used to be very peaceful, living side to side with Buddhist, Christian and Muslim. But now, because of the Buddhist extremists and also government not stopping them, now we treat each other with doubt. We treat each other with, oh, you're going to take over my house. You're going to take over my religion. So I think we lost the wonderful friendship that we were already building. And I think it's a very sad thing that, people don't trust each other anymore just because we belong to a different religion.
There was a lady at the back row there.
Actually, can I say one thing? No? I just wanted to say, I just wanted to say a word, seeing that she's being criticized from all sides in favor of Aung San Suu Kyi, because as you've heard, she's widely criticized in the West for not standing up for Muslims. In Burma, she's criticized for standing up for Muslims. Her party were the only ones who voted against this legislation, which is actually disgusting legislation. Well, I apologize for her because she's not a saint. Her objective is to get power. And she doesn't see that she can do very much by remaining forever in opposition. So her objective is to win the election. And then I'm going to say, then you'll see. We'll see what happens. We don't know what happens if she wins the election. But this would change the situation substantially from present. There would at least be, the military would at least be faced with a dilemma at this point. So actually, I think that politics is useful.
Hi. Jill Kavanagh, formerly Peace Nexus Foundation in Yangon. I'm just curious, I think we've spoken a lot about the elections, but I think it's possible to argue that the peace process is an equally, if not more, significant process that's currently being undertaken in the country. And I'm just wondering, will they sign? Who will sign? And will it matter if they do?
Okay. Elections come and go, but the peace process will be a more. Who'd like to?
Should I start being ethnic? Well, I think it's when you say about peace process or ceasefire agreement, it seems like two meanings. But currently, Burmese government doing is they want the ceasefire agreement. They're not interested in the peace process because it's clearly mentioned about the General Milon, like 6 point. You know, so he already set up his rule. So it's like it's become the peace process is more like a treaty, you know, rather than ceasefire. Ceasefire is more about when you're looking at the Northern Ireland ceasefire and so on. It's more a lot about political negotiation and so on. But this is more about the interest of Burmese military government is if they get that ceasefire agreement from any group, that is like a green card for them. They will show the European Union for cash and in the war, and then they will do a shopping trip around the world. That is their interest. So, peace process is everybody's love it. Everybody who wants peace. Everybody wants peace. But we don't want ceasefire on paper. We want a grantee political dialogue. Because for the Kachin experience, we already been through 17 years of ceasefire without the political guarantee. So that learns a lot for us. So you're exactly right. The peace process is even more important than election. But currently, that peace process, the General Banla was saying, after he went to the meeting with the Deng Xian, and then all the guys from MPC, the Myanmar Peace Center, they was kind of putting pressure to him that, all the scenario in the over the war, sign the ceasefire first, and then political dialogue, the second. But now all the ethnic groups said, we want to sign a ceasefire, inclusively, everybody, nobody left out. But what Deng Xian government said, oh no, you can't sign everyone. They just say, oh, your kind group, they're not allowed to sign. Kukan, we will deal with them separately. Palong, we will send Ao Min, who is dodgy car seller. He will make a day, that's it. The next day that car broken down, he doesn't care. That sort of attitude we're facing. So I think we can see at the moment, so far, as an ethnic group, ethnic people, we can see that the peace process is going more about, show business, getting the green card.
Richard, you look at this stuff. Elections come and go. Ceasefires come and go in Burma as well, don't they?
They do. I mean, I'll say three quick things about this. First of all, I agree. It's fair enough. I think it's fair to say that certainly in the ethnic minority areas, the ceasefire peace, in the end, peace deals is a far bigger deal than this election. That's what they're interested in. Secondly, what we have so far is a lot of ceasefires, and they are pretty well just that, ceasefires, and often the firing hasn't ceased very much anyway. Beyond that, of course, is a political process to finally secure lasting peace between, say, the Karen and the Burman, the Chin and the Burman, the peripheries and the centre. That involves a wholesale rethinking of the country. It requires profound political transformation of the whole of relationships between the centre and the peripheries. It means, in the end, converting what is now a highly centralised, unified state into some sort of federal system. And, you know, we've barely scratched the surface of thinking about what that system would be. Would it be ethnic-based? Probably many people would favour a more Indian-style system, linguistic-based. How big would the states be? What sort of rights would minorities within the states have to protect them against what would then be the ethnic majorities in the states, such as the Shan, etc. These are sort of huge problems, and goes back to my original point that Burma never had a functioning political system. So it's a huge kind of process that awaits us, even if these processes work. And I'm afraid, I think I agree with you, it's been rushed so far. The government desperately wanted a legacy. Thein Sein wanted a legacy. He wanted something really big to leave behind when his term came to an end, and that was going to be this nationwide ceasefire deal. So they've just been making up willy-nilly, rushing around the country, a little bit of something for the Kachin here, have a little deal for the Chin here, and then something else blows up here. Oh God, we can't do it yet. They've been promising the nationwide ceasefire agreement for pretty well 2 years now, and we won't get it before the election. But you know, it's going to be a real struggle, I think, to get the peace, the actual negotiations about a political settlement rolling on, even if these ceasefires hold.
But you have to start somewhere. But you
yes,
have to start
and the
somewhere.
accusation, which I think is quite right, is that the government, that so far the Kachin and others do not see in the government a sincerity about changing the distribution of power in Burma, because that's what it's all about. They don't see the commitment to that sort of political change that will, and that's the only thing that will bring a lasting peace in the country.
The ceasefire, I'm not here to defend this government, by the way. I don't like them. I want to see them gone. But I do think that they have actually been making and Aung Min, I don't think it's quite fair to describe him as a used car salesman. Most times I see Aung Min, he's completely exhausted by what he's trying to do, because well, I actually don't think that this is really correct, because he's actually been working. It's quite difficult when you've got 17 different groups negotiating to get an agreement. If you look at the draft agreement at the moment, the draft ceasefire agreement is a very unusual ceasefire agreement, because it's not mostly about what the military are going to do. It's mostly about the political process afterwards. And it starts off with a section called Basic Principles, and it says, we agree to implement the nationwide ceasefire agreement in accordance with the following principles: established a union based on principles of democracy and federalism in accordance with the outcomes of political dialogue, in the spirit of Panglong and so on. Now, a little while back, you wouldn't have had any Burmese government or military talking about federalism. So there's already in this ceasefire agreement quite an important principle established from the start, that this is going to be a federal union. Now you can say, this is all cynical, this is all a trick, and you can carry on fighting. That's one method. The alternative method is you try and test the sincerity by actually letting it happening, by having the peace negotiations and by having elections.
Wayne in, then we'll get another question. Go on.
I think I really like what you said. It's just, you know, we need to remember the difference between a nationwide ceasefire and people feeling genuine about peace, getting peace in the country. Signing a paper is very easy, but, you know, implementing peace on the ground is very difficult. You know, while there are a lot of ceasefire negotiation going on, the Burmese government is still attacking people in Kachin state and in other area in ethnic, you know, places, and their soldiers are still raping women and children in their country, so in ethnic areas. So if they are very genuine about building a genuine peace and, you know, respecting ethnic people, their culture and their tradition, they would hold accountable, you know, soldiers for raping children and raping women, and they would do that. And also they would be willing to talk properly about peace rather than forcing ethnic people to sign a piece of paper. Which, you know,
They're
Kachin
not
did that
forcing
in-
them to sign it. They
Kachin-
haven't signed it yet.
Yes,
If they could
Kachin-
force them to sign it, they would sign it.
But Kachin did that in the past. You signed a ceasefire agreement, they broke it. So we don't want, it's understandable that ethnic people don't want to sign a piece of paper which can be broken the next day. So we need to find, you know, everlasting peace. It's, of course...
Without signing any piece of paper.
No, we need to talk about proper dialogue. We need, you know, we need...
This is what the ceasefire agreement is all about. It's about dialogue.
But they want to make it happen, like they, you know, Thein Sein want it to be his legacy. And also, you know, it's very difficult to talk about peace while your soldiers are raping children in their ethnic area. And also, if you respect ethnic people and if you respect their culture, we need to talk about the root causes of the problem, not, you know, say this is just a pause. Ceasefire agreement is just a pause. We need to talk about the root causes of the problem. We, you know, the government need to respect the rights of ethnic people. Government need to respect the culture of the ethnic people, rather than say, let's sign this and let's get it over with.
That's not what this says. What this agreement says is it says, let's sign this and then have a dialogue about all the things that you're talking about.
Can I try
That's what the
and squeeze in a
whole
couple
agreement
more
is about.
questions? Gentleman on the end of the row there. He had his hand up. Did you still want to ask a question? Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. My name is Ko Aung, and I'm a human rights activist and a former political prisoner, and I'm now practicing human rights law in United Kingdom. Firstly, I would like to thank Mr. Robert for the, also including EU for the really love and the peace in my country. But you may know that, you know, the people of Burma are love peace. The people are suffering and they have been gunned down by the village. They are raped, they killed, the people, their children have been killed. Their wives have been raped. I don't think, you know, like, I don't think that EU will be, including you, and EU will be love, peace, no more than people of Burma.
I don't need a question.
Yeah,
No
okay.
questions.
And second thing, you know, like, there is no such a transform that taking place in Burma. It is not transform taking place not for the democracy, for the military. They want to transform the military, that's all. Not about the transform the democracy. My question is how we can achieve peace under this 2008 constitution. And then second question, which is how can we achieve the 2015 election if still 2008 constitution now exists? These two questions. Thank you.
It's kind of the last question, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we're back to the peace building thing. I mean, they kind of answered that question as much as...
No, nobody's answered it.
Well, yeah, okay, I know. Well, would you like to say something else about it then?
No, I'd like to hear how how you think peace should be achieved.
I think it's quite wrong to, you know, target me the whole you know, throughout the panel. Why should it's because no, I am a very outspoken.
No, you've been saying that you're against signing a ceasefire
no, I
agreement.
think,
so
no, I am not
I'd be
saying,
interested in your
saying
alternative.
anything about how peace agreement should happen. I was saying is that it's important to recognize the human rights abuses. I think we have a different side. I think I think most of the things you know said were quite positive. Let's wait and see. What I'm saying is it's quite hard to, as a Burmese, it's quite hard to find it. Let's wait and see approach work, because we have waited and see, you know, how the government is going to help our country. It's not helping us. I mean, I'm a human rights activist. I care about the people in my country. I stand up for the people who are suffering in my country. And I don't want someone to come and tell me and say, let's wait and see. You know, of course people are dying, but maybe in the future we would have peace. So I'm not saying, I'm not an expert of peace agreement. I don't have an expertise in that area, but what I'm saying is we need to address the root causes of the problem. I talk about the 2008 constitution, and I talk about the motivation behind the whole reform process. So I think it's quite it's quite unfair to target me in the whole panel.
Ceasefire. We have one more. We have got time for another question. But there's a lady here down the front. She's had her hand up. Can you wait for the microphone? Just a second.
Peace politics are very, very influenced by the power base linked to economics. Haven't really heard much about the changing economic situation, the changing relations that Burma has. For example, economics deals led largely with the Chinese in the past. Now the 5th largest investor is the British. Should the British be engaging this way? I wasn't quite sure when you did mention economics, and you did bring it up as an influencing factor, but I didn't actually hear anything from the panel what the British should be doing. We know about the history of the British, but should Britain be engaging not just as supporting of a peace process and that, but economically?
Yes, I think so, absolutely. Now, British or Western investment, I mean, as I'm sure we'll hear, what it was the Western economic withdrawal, this is the great debate about sanctions, was bitterly resented by the Burmese because it meant that the best practices left the country and they were left with Chinese companies who didn't care a sod about human rights, etc. So to them, the sanctions to ordinary Burmans, to many of them, and especially in the ethnic areas, it was a disaster because the people who practiced the best policies had the best pay, who had some regard for human rights left, and they were left with Chinese who didn't care at all. So I think it's so, and the companies that stayed, GHL, Total, Elf, etc., endured a lot of criticism. But I think it's good that Western companies should be back in there. They're wanted back in there. I mean, there are good reasons for them not to go back, but that's economic reasons. That the infrastructure is terrible and. So,
5th largest investor is probably pretty small.
Yeah, yes, I mean, British is very small, and we're actually way behind Chinese, even Malaysians, Singaporeans, Japans, etc. So our contribution actually is pretty tiddly, but nonetheless, I think it's fine. It's the largest Western, yes, after America.
Hkanhpa, do you see any way of this process happening, this investment happening that doesn't steal everything?
I was quite sad to hear that, you're talking about my country as a commodity. Quite sad, actually. But when you're looking at that, I think it's the Western, Europeans, and American, and Chinese, and then you're forgetting about India. India is the huge economic interest in Burma. But when you're looking into it, I feel myself as a victim of economic frontier. Which everybody wanted to tap in our door. They're not interested in the well-being of the country. I think the Western country they have the ethical issue and so on. But at the end of the day, they're making money. That's all. So that's what I'd like to say. Really, it is quite sad. But one thing I'd like to add the Robert's question. I want to give hand to Wei Hing, my fellow citizen. If we want to achieve the peace, show in the practice on the ground. That's all. All what happening on the ground is opposite to on the paper, opposite to on the media. What actually happening on the grassroots is totally opposite. So if Burmese government or anybody wanted to change Burma peace, start from the grassroots, show in the grassroots but how sincere they are, show by practice, in reality, rather than, it's amazing textbook, ceasefire textbook, the best vocabulary they can get it from, you can get anything. Things in speech on the Myanmar TV is the best you can listen to about the democracy, the meaning of democracy. He can tell the whole night about the meaning of democracy. Aung San Suu Kyi too. I was listening to Aung San Suu Kyi manifesto. Great to listen. But in practice, she kicked out the Muslim candidate. So, show us in reality. Then we will achieve the peace.
So weighing in, working with elections, it's messy, but it's a thing to get involved with. Is economic investment the same sort of principle?
So I mentioned about trade in the beginning. So when sanctions were lifted, and a lot of companies were going in and making investment and making trade, and also I think it was helped because a lot of human rights was slipping down the international community agenda. It was, and also we had a new government in the UK, and their main policy was economy. So they're kind of promoting international trade. Trump, they're promoting human rights in Asia, and including Burma. So we had a lot of British companies going in, and also not only trade and business. The British government decided to give training to the Burmese military, who are still committing human rights abuses in ethnic area.
They're
So
giving them training in human rights, actually.
Yes, whose soldiers are still committing human rights abuses in ethnic area. And EU trained police in Burma, and those police abuses student leaders. This year when there was a student protest against the education bill in the country. So I'm not saying everything is wrong, but it's hard to ignore those human rights abuses, which are still going on. An international community could help a lot. And we saw sanctions as an example, that where there were a lot of pressure from the international community, and government realized that they needed to make some changes. They needed to, give some freedom to the people, so they could get sanctions and other pressure lifted. So, I think a lot of people got overexcited and giddy about it and gone into Burma, do business, giving training to Burmese army, while armies are still raping people, and giving police training to police, while police are still abusing citizens of Burma. So there needs to be a balance. It's okay to give help, but at the same time, don't be so cowardly to talk about the human rights abuses in the country.
Okay. I'm good.
Maybe I could.
Quickly, because
Well,
we're kind of out of time.
I say one thing on the economics. Actually, not that much Western investment has taken place. A lot of companies have visited, but most of them want to see what happens next. And they'll probably wait and see what happens in the elections, and they'll want to see if the place is stable and what the economic environment is going to be like. So there's not been a vast flood of Western investment. There's been a flood of visitors, but they're actually holding back from investment.
But there has been a flood of Asian investment.
Well,
We are way behind. No, I'm not
yeah,
talking
that's
about
that's
Thai,
been
Malaysian,
going on for a while,
Japanese,
yes.
etc. But that's
Yes.
really
Okay.
picked up.
Yes.
We've run out of time.
since 2000.
We've run out of time, but I'm going to do that because it's a journalist club, so I can do this, right? So Jim, I'm going to ask you to call the election, and you've got 1 minute because that's all you get on like the news at 10. So I'm going to give you 1 minute each to just call the election as you really think. Not how you'd like it to turn out, but how you think it's going to turn out. Just a quick minute. Where are we going to be on November the 9th, 10th, whenever we get the results?
And you should call the election in terms of percentage of seats in Parliament won.
Yes, if you'd like to. Yes, go ahead.
No, because that's what matters.
Well, you can start. Go on.
I mean, I guess that the NLD will get more than 50% of the seats, which doesn't mean that they've got anything like a majority, because the military have got, I guess they'll get more than 50% of the seats up for election. The big unknown is how well the ethnic parties do. And so let's say the ethnic parties get 30%, maybe the USDP gets 20, maybe the NLD does a bit better than that. NLD gets 55, ethnic parties get 25, and USDP gets the rest. I don't know.
Okay.
It's uncallable, actually. There's no opinion polls. There's nothing.
Can't say that on the 10th.
Nobody knows.
Wayne, what do you think is going to happen?
I think it's very encouraging that a lot of human rights activists are getting involved in this election with NLD and other parties. So it will be interesting to see what's going to happen on the day. But a lot of people who are getting involved know that we are not going to be nearer to genuine democracy and peace. So we all see it as a step forward, and we will have a lot of things to do. And if NLD is in the parliament, then hopefully they will be able to change the constitution. So maybe we are, you know, like a tiny step closer to changing the constitution and achieving democracy, but election is not the test to see, you know, Burma's so-called transition to democracy.
Okay. Hkanhpa, Kachin aside, what do you really think this election's?
Election
Who's going to?
is another positive thing. I want to say it's good for exercise. Good for exercise. You know, exercising, putting the vote and so on.
Yeah.
That's it. Nothing else.
Okay.
Because, you know, 2008 Constitution is unchangeable Constitution. Designed to be unchangeable Constitution. So we, like General Mbanda said, 2008 Constitution is like his old Chinese-made Jeep. If you fix here, it's broken down in some place.
Yeah.
So you have to buy a new car. So you have to throw that 2008 Constitution away and then get a new Constitution. Otherwise, election is only exercise.
Okay. Richard, you get the last call.
Okay, I'll call it. I think yes, I think NLD will probably get over 50% of the seats. I think the ethnic minority parties will do very well in the States, and they'll probably get another 20% or something. The military retain their 25% bloc. The problem is that I don't see much cooperation between the NLD and the ethnic minority parties, so that doesn't give a majority to change the constitution. It'll be very messy, and you won't get much change as a result.
Okay, thank you very much. We went over time. I'm sorry we didn't get more questions in.